If you were to make a film about Lincoln, you would probably start with the Gettysburg Address, maybe a reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, or the House Divided speech, the Lincoln Douglas debates, or something else that showcases his mesmerizing speaking ability. Or, like this film, you could do racial war crimes. 2012's Lincoln is a film by Steven Spielberg, written by Tony Kushner, and it depicts the 4 month period from the end of 1864 and into 1865. It covers peace talks between the Union and the Confederacy and the debate around the 13th Amendment in the House of Representatives. Much of it is based on Doris Goodwin's work Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln. In this review, we will examine its general portrayal of Lincoln and the events of the era, as well as some more specific details that the film gets spot on, and some where it may have missed the mark. Part 1: The Portrayal of Lincoln. The high point of the film, and where it is arguably closest in feel to history, is Daniel Day-Lewis's portrayal of Abraham Lincoln himself. Even the reedy, twangy voice is probably closer to how the actual president sounded. While older depictions such as Henry Peck's The Blue and the Gray give him a deep, powerful baritone, Lincoln biographer Harold Holzer points out that Daniel Day-Lewis had it closer. Many contemporary sources commented on the higher pitch of Lincoln's voice, though they do point out that it still had the ability to carry across a crowd. The film has Lincoln speak more than a few times, and any commentator could tell you that Lincoln was quick to tell his story, and even people who found his appearance goofy were usually swayed by his intelligence and his ability to connect with an audience. The Gettysburg Address is famous for not being the headline speech of the day, but having a lasting effect due to its brevity and invocation of easy-to-understand emotions and values. You also see other examples of this. While speaking about wanting to curtail the spread of slavery, Lincoln told the story of having a snake in a bed with kids. If you try to bash and kill the snake, you may hurt the kids, but if you can sneak the snake out, it'll probably leave on its own or die. While Seward and other contemporaries used haughtier themes like the Trojan horse as an analogy for the spread of slavery into the territories, audiences may not know the story of Troy. They would, however, be able to connect to the idea of wanting to protect one's kids. Lincoln just had a way to find the perfect story for the perfect moment. Although his story about the stormy ship Omen before a big event wasn't told to his wife in 1865, but rather from a recollected letter from his friend Joshua Speed in 1864, this was a real story that he told. Just like the story about him representing a woman accused of murdering her abusive husband while he was a lawyer and letting the lady escape, these stories are at least drawn from real recollections. The film did its homework when it comes to Lincoln's actual jokes, stories, and speeches. Having an entire telegraph office laughing along with him is pretty true to the reports we hear about Lincoln, and we know he loved jokes, even practical ones. In his bachelor days, Lincoln, a grown man, would hide objects as a practical joke and laugh about it, so it's nice to see this side of his nature being shown this way in the film. Even when he gets serious and gives his speech to the cabinet, "I am the President of the United States, clothed with immense power," you can't help but be enchanted. That quote might also be real, but I will note that is from a recollection after the fact. The film does use recollections and secondhand sources, so be aware of that. Lincoln was said by observers to have ready good humor and be both kind and gentle, and his stories in the film convey that nicely. This sums up a big part of what the movie is trying to do. It gets the general vibes right, but doesn't really concern itself for the when and where and those sorts of details. Lincoln was a natural storyteller and able to win his biggest rivals or critics over with his powers of logic and persuasion, and that's what the film wants to focus on. Daniel Day-Lewis is captivating every time he opens his mouth, and the film is spot on in showing how a Lincoln story could enthrall an entire room, just like many of the sources from Goodwin's book can attest to. He moves with awkwardness, but he speaks with deliberate logic and reason and connects to the common people while also being a skillful politician. If you're a fan of Lincoln biographies or works like Goodwin's, just watching this portrayal alone makes the film something special. Part 2: Lincoln the Politician. Tommy Lee Jones, in his portrayal of the fiery abolitionist Thaddeus Stevens, sums up the thesis of the film when ruminating on the importance of the 13th Amendment, calling it the greatest measure of the 19th century, passed by corruption, aided and abetted by the purest man in America. While Goodwin's massive volume is full of people remarking how genuine Lincoln was, he was, at the end of the day, a politician, and you know the story about what happens if their mouths are moving. Whatever his opinions on race, which we'll talk about later, this film shows the lengths he was willing to go to in order to pass the 13th Amendment. Michael Vorenberg argues that one of the reasons Lincoln authorized an African colonization venture right on the eve of the Emancipation Proclamation was to build up political capital, even though it seemed a bit contradictory to do so. These were the types of calculations Lincoln actually did in history. When Lincoln was debating Douglas, did he say he didn't believe white and black people were fully equal because he was a turbo racist, or was he telling the people of southern and central Illinois what they wanted to hear and catering to his constituency? While he surely had some racist views, being a product of his time, he also frequently seemed to tell voters what they wanted to hear, which sure sounds like any bog-standard politician. So should we call him Dishonest Abe? Probably not. Too many contemporary sources, including many from Goodwin's work, don't paint him in that sort of light, though Lincoln himself points out in the film, and in his actual speeches, how divisive he was in the later years of the American Civil War. It is more likely that whatever his personal opinions and how they may have evolved, Lincoln was very careful and deliberate in his speech, since, as the film highlights, he was an especially crafty politician. Lincoln famously made men like Seward or Chase into allies when they had previously been rivals, and he created quite the effective cabinet around himself. He was also deliberate and tactful when firing members of the War Department or generals during the American Civil War, so it's hard to paint him as malicious or dishonest, even if his opinions were bad by our standards of today. The film alludes to this when Lincoln speaking to Elizabeth Keckley and expressing that he isn't sure about integration and race relations after slavery, which is pretty close to what some of his actual journal notes that were collected after and Team of Rivals had to say about the issue. He notes there that he wasn't sure if he believed white and black people were equal, and he might get there someday, but America might take longer to get there. So again, we see some possible political calculations. Lincoln also suspended the writ of habeas corpus, utilized martial law, did a draft, and though he was frequently concerned about the constitutionality and legal basis for these actions, as he would frequently tell people in his cabinet debates, he would stretch things when it met a political end for him. The film captures this skill in passing the 13th Amendment, but it also portrays his willingness to use appointments or lobbying in order to achieve his ends. How this lobbying was done, though, and the main crux of the film, if the Southern peace talks would derail the 13th Amendment, requires a lot of playing fast and loose with locations, names, timelines, even if the general vibe is pretty close. As we will see, most of the entire driving drama of the film, whether the Southern peace talks would derail the 13th Amendment and whether enough congressmen could be swayed to pass the amendment, requires some creative changing of the actual details and facts. Part 3. Timelines, Accuracy, and Inspiration. The three lobbyists are a good place to look at where the film sticks to history, where it opts to stick to historical themes, and where it uses, shall we say, heavy artistic license for the particulars. From the get-go, Lincoln is speaking with Union troops about the Poison Springs and Jenkins Ferry massacres is interesting because most films don't cover racial massacres and killing of prisoners of war, but actual recruits probably wouldn't have already memorized the Gettysburg Address by January of 1865, and these fictional soldiers going from the 2nd Kansas Colored Regiment to the 5th Massachusetts this quickly isn't really plausible. But again, it's there to show how Lincoln could connect with regular people even if it's blurring the actual facts. Lincoln's office probably didn't have a picture of William Henry Harrison, and he probably wouldn't have let a child play with photographic negatives like this due to how delicate they were. Also, as we said, the ominous vessel and distant shore speech was taken from a letter he wrote to Joshua Speed in 1864, and Lincoln did have it before many big events, not just as important for wanting to shoot for the 13th Amendment. The film doesn't mind rearranging this way because who doesn't love some good omens and foreshadowing? Republican politics is also an interesting departure. Seward asked Lincoln, when has our party ever agreed on anything? And getting their own party in line is one of the first obstacles to the 13th Amendment. But by this point, most of the Republican Party was in line on the actual historical 13th Amendment. In fact, they already almost unanimously voted for it in the House in 1864, and the only no vote from a Republican was the bill's sponsor, Ohio's Ashley, since he wanted to reconsider it later if they could get more Democratic votes. By this point, most of the Republican infighting was shifting to arguments about what would happen in Reconstruction, but the film is keeping things more streamlined for the audience. For the most part, in fact, I should note the names and dispositions of the congressmen are off, if not right, fictional in the name of drama. Having Congress vote by state and having these disagreements within the states is certainly dramatic, but in reality these roll calls would have been alphabetical. It's hard to do in a film where they're swapping out the names and votes though, so it does make sense to help with the comprehension of the audience. The Seward lobbying effect is also based on broad stroke facts, but some of the details are a little different. There were 3 actual men named Bilbo, Shell, and Latham, and they were authorized by Seward to lobby for the 13th Amendment and try and flip lame duck Democratic votes. In the film, they're funny, drinking, smoking, swearing, and being put up in a, quote, squirrel-infested hotel. But in reality, they were better connected and respected, with Bilbo being described as known for his elaborate waistcoats, his long sideburns, and his elegant manners, and having even met Lincoln in 1864 and corresponding with him in 1865. Latham actually refused being reimbursed for his lobbying efforts by Seward later in life. Also, likely the actual historical lobbyists were focused in New York, which was Seward's political base, and working heavily with newspapers. While political office seeking and appointments were so prominent that Lincoln actually had to limit and schedule office seekers even going back to his first term, there was only one lame duck Democrat who switched his vote, Wells A. Hutchins of Ohio, for which he never took an appointment or office. He had supported Lincoln before, including suspending habeas corpus, and on the 1862 D.C. slavery ban, so it wasn't all that unusual for him to jump the aisle and support the president. Overall, the lobbyists are portrayed as seedy and shady because it helps modern audiences understand that Lincoln was a politician and was definitely willing to bend or break the rules for political ends. The race at the end during the actual 13th Amendment vote is fictional, and really the entire pairing of the 13th Amendment vote and the Southern peace delegation relies on distorting the timeline, whereas they were pretty separate issues. It's the central point of the drama in the film, and the race makes for an interesting climax, so we understand why the film did it. It just doesn't match up with the history. The note that Lincoln carefully worded saying that he isn't aware of any Southern peace representatives is based on a recollection from Representative Ashley of Ohio, but this mad dash to bring the note to the floor of Congress and read it to assuage the worries of fictional conservative Republican Aaron Haddam, all fabricated. We see that the entire 13th Amendment versus Southern Peace Delegation clash only works because the film erases a second trip from Blair going down to the South, and it condenses the travel process that ranged from December 1864 to January 29th of 1865 so that it better overlays on the debate of the 13th Amendment for the sake of drama and tension. This overall theme of the film, with Lincoln being a measured, moderate man who's willing to bend and break, wheel and deal to get his objectives accomplished, also runs into a hitch with Thaddeus Stevens. Stevens, while being known for always being sharp of wit and having a retort, definitely resorts to a lot more personal insults in the film compared to what we see in sources. We also see a big victory for Lincoln when he meets with Stevens and convinces him to back down on racial equality in the name of getting the amendment passed. While that helps Lincoln's depiction in the film, Stevens already acknowledged this, and he had already written about it 10 days before the debate on the 13th Amendment. Stevens is also a little more important and central to the radical Republicans in the film versus in reality it was a much larger and more in-depth coalition. But kind of like with Lincoln's cabinet, if you are watching this movie for the side characters, it's going to leave you a little bit disappointed. Other than Lincoln and Seward and some of the big heavy hitters, we see that the film is not afraid to play fast and loose with the supporting cast. Part 4, Lincoln and Family. While showing Lincoln's marriage as strained, his fatherhood as overly doting and caring, minus when he slapped Robert, and such, all adds interesting flavor and seeks to humanize Lincoln, it should be noted that we don't have a lot of primary source writings from within the family themselves. A lot of what we know is secondhand, and much of it was recollected and recorded after the war. So, did Lincoln almost put Mary Todd in an institution? Were things rough with Mary? It's hard to say. We don't actually know. He and Mary were both recorded throughout their lives as having succumbed to episodes of melancholy for protracted periods, including with the death of Willie for Mary. But when film Mary accuses Lincoln of feeling trapped in the marriage, it's difficult to say how true this is. Historians have speculated endlessly on if Lincoln wasn't really into her, if he was actually gay or bisexual, or what. But here is what we actually know. Lincoln was most likely involved with a woman named Anne Rutledge, and when she died, he did fall into an episode of melancholy. So them talking about depression and melancholic episodes is based on what we know in reality. He had an engagement with Mary Owens that didn't work out, which Lincoln didn't seem too enthusiastic about, and his letters to Joshua Speed make it seem like he needed some amping up to actually take the step and marry Mary Todd. Some historians also point out that Lincoln slept in the same bed with Joshua Speed during his bachelor years. The film possibly alludes to this, with Lincoln making one comment to a young soldier in the telegraph office that he was born in the wrong time, or another young government aide for asking Lincoln if he wanted company, to which Lincoln says no. So was Lincoln secretly gay and in a terrible marriage, and was the film pointing this out? The answer is that we can't really know, since that's doing a lot of modern projecting onto 19th century norms. It wasn't uncommon for men in that era to board together in beds and hold hands and even write each other what we would call love letters. If you read Team of Rivals for yourselves, it is chock full of men writing about their love for each other and then going on to marry women and being happy and having boatloads of kids. Lincoln's path to marriage then doesn't look all that different from men of the era, nor do his interactions with Joshua Speed. In fact, it's hard to say that Lincoln felt trapped by Robert's birth, since he wasn't actually a shotgun kid like the film implies, but rather he was born almost 9 months to the day after Lincoln's wedding night, so he may not have been all that unenthusiastic about getting down with Mary Todd. I like how the film portrays Lincoln as not being perfect, because Lord knows we have recordings about them arguing about things like money. Mary often wanted to hold parties and galas and fight for her place among high society, which did judge her a lot, and so she wanted to up her dress and appearance, and Lincoln wasn't a fan of the costs associated with it. Fun fact, Lincoln using terms like shindig or flubdub when complaining about Mary's spending is true to actual correspondence in Goodwin's book, so good on the film for that. That said, we don't have a great understanding of what happened behind closed doors using actual primary sources, so again, the themes are really interesting, showing the family as human and flawed, and more to what we would consider real people who aren't perfect, but the history might not actually be there. There are many more small details that the film twists, omits, or changes, but I'm trying not to make this review 2 hours long, and I think by now you get the idea. Gets a lot of the themes right, but it's stretching what sources we have and then filling in blanks with sources we don't. Part 5, Artistic License. Overall, if you want a film that portrays Lincoln as a flawed but ultimately good man who is great at giving speeches and connecting with common folk, but also does shady politician stuff, then this is a film for you. Daniel Day-Lewis is on point, giving Lincoln a shrill but powerful voice who nonetheless captivates every crowd in front of whom he speaks. It introduces themes about Reconstruction, abolition, and racial politics of the 19th century, and provides all the drama and intrigue one would expect from a Steven Spielberg movie. If you're looking for an accurate play-by-play of the passage of the 13th Amendment, then I definitely wouldn't cite this film for a school assignment or anything. It plays very fast and loose with names, dates, and even the debates in order to put the 13th Amendment against a possible Southern early path to peace, events which we know weren't actually all that connected. Congressmen have their names and opinions changed, and the debates from the 13th Amendment in the film aren't there in the Congressional Globe, so they're there for drama purposes. In fact, a Connecticut representative got mad in 2013 because the film had 2 Connecticut members vote nay on the amendment, even though the actual reality was all of Connecticut voted aye. Little details like that are what I mean when I say that the film should get an A for its general feel and vibe in how it portrays Lincoln, but the actual history is probably a C or a D. Again, don't go citing this for school. I recommend it though because of the portrayal of Lincoln, because of the portrayal of backroom politics. And I think it's a quality film and raises some interesting historical reminders that Honest Abe was in fact a politician. And from the beginning to the end of his career, he did political things, including some less than savory ones. Thank you guys for watching, and apologies for the long hiatus. It took a while to research all this, and life gets busy as it tends to do. If you liked it, comment and subscribe, or put a like on the video itself since I'm trying to get back in the swing of things. As always, stay excited about history.